Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Julia Turan. I'm the Communications Manager at the Physiological Society, and I'm excited to welcome you to Publishing for Beginners, which is the first webinar in our professional development series that's running over the next few months. So we have two presentations that will last around an hour total, and then we'll open it up the floor to questions. So before we start the presentations, I just have a few quick logistical notes. The webinar is being recorded, but your questions will remain anonymous. So this is just important because you don't need to note down the slides or anything, as you'll be able to watch the webinar back later. Feel free to ask questions throughout any of the presentations in the Q&A function, as I'll be going through these and picking up the questions to be answered after both of the presentations have ended. And if you have any questions that we don't have time for, then you can send them to Sally Howells, who will be the first presenter, and I will put her email in the chat for you. So the only questions that we won't be able to answer are about the suitability of your papers for submission to the Journal of Physiology and Experimental Physiology. So the best way to find this out instead will be to email your abstract to the journal, and I'll also put these contact emails into the chat for you. So now that we've gone through all that, I just want to introduce our first speaker, Sally Howells. She is the publisher at the Physiological Society, which means she's also managing editor of our journals, the Journal of Physiology and Experimental Physiology. She oversees the editorial side of the journals, as well as peer review, production, marketing, and ethics. So without further ado, I will hand over to Sally.
Thank you, Julia. As Julia said, I'm Sally Howells, publisher at the Physiological Society. And today, I hope that we'll be able to learn lots of things together, and here are some of the learning outcomes. You'll hopefully get some tips on how to write a paper for publication, how to pick a good journal, and how to get more involved with peer review. And you'll hear some steps that Calum Wilson has made to become more involved in the sort of editorial board processing, so looking at decision making, and he'll explain how he has got involved with the sort of behind the scenes look of the Journal of Physiology. As Julia said, she'll put the email addresses in the chat, but I will also have my email address and the journal specific email addresses on my last slide, so you don't need to frantically write down anything either. So hopefully you're here because you know you need to publish, but why do you need to do that? Well, if you haven't got a record of your project, then it's as if nothing's been done. So nothing really exists until you've had a publication. And also, if you haven't published, no one's going to know that you exist, and that you're not going to get funded to do any future work. So publishing is vital for your academic career. So in this workshop, as I mentioned, we'll look at peer review, picking the right journal, writing a paper, and also some ethical issues, which we see fairly commonly in publishing overall. Thankfully, not too often in our journals, but there's some interesting things on what not to do at the end. So peer review, it has been going since 1665. The first peer-reviewed journal was Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. Since then, obviously, the number of journals has grown, the scientific output has grown, but actually peer review as a concept really hasn't changed at all. So obviously back in the day, there was no technology to help them. You know, you would mail your manuscripts to someone, and then they will be mailed out. So the actual mechanisms of peer review have changed very little. But obviously technology has helped us speed things along a little bit. Although back in 1665, I think they probably had at least five mail drops per day. So perhaps things are on significantly quicker. So what is peer review, and why is it important? Hopefully you'll know this already, but really from our point of view, it's a screening process. It allows journals and readers to know that a paper is valid and it's passed a quality threshold. It also looks at the importance of the findings. So perhaps depending on where it's published, you could make a judgment on its importance. And it's really also there to maintain the integrity of science. My job is to make sure that the Physiological Society journals are ethically produced and adhere to the best practice in scientific research and publishing. So it really, a journal really does act as that quality control. It also makes your paper find its right home. So it's probably, if you submit to a journal and gets accepted straight away, it'll be very rare, but perhaps you'll be thinking, well, maybe I should have aimed a bit higher. Maybe I should have gone for that Nature, Science, Cell paper. Maybe I shouldn't have aimed low. So it kind of helps you find the right home. Most people will aim high because they think their research is brilliant, and then they may get rejected, revise their paper, submit to another journal, perhaps lower down the ranks. So it will help you find the right home for your paper, maybe not straight away. And this is really a schematic of peer review, very simplified. There are lots of loops along the way. So I'm not sure if you can see where my mouse is hovering, but at the top, we've got this is where you come in. This is the completion of your experiments and writing up. And then you submit to a journal. And the process straight down the middle is to straight acceptance and publication, which is, of course, what we all think should happen to our research, but it rarely does. So it really goes through these other little loops. You could get rejected straight away. You can be triaged. So that's a process whereby it gets submitted to a journal, but the journal editors really don't think that it will ever be revised sufficiently well to meet the scope or the quality threshold of that journal. So it may get a triage decision, which usually happens in a few days or so. Most papers follow the revision and resubmission re-review route. So Calum's got some data in his slides, but we do at the Journal of Physiology and Experimental Physiology, approximately 30% are triaged. The rest go out for review. Of those, sort of 50–60% are rejected, and then the others sort of go through this revision loop and then hopefully towards acceptance. So pretty much no one goes straight down the middle, straight to acceptance. So don't be put off by receiving negative comments. The types of peer review, most in life sciences are this top one, single blind. It's where the referees know who you are, but you don't know who they are. There's also double blind, where no one knows who they are, and also completely open, where everyone knows everyone. Now, as you will see from the little bullet points below, each of these have pros and cons. One of the things that really I think has stopped people being double blind is it's really difficult to ever be truly blinded. If it's in a small research area, you can probably still work out which lab is doing the research. So you could go to the wrong assumption. You think you know, and you're making judgments based on that. So at the moment, single blind peer review seems to be what's most used for life sciences. There are now a few journals which do open peer review, and there again are pros and cons in that. You can look up, there's plenty of examples of them online. Excuse me. So the referee is one role within the whole decision-making process. The editors use referee reports to help them make their decision. It's not, right, I've got 3 reports in, 2 say yes, 1 says no, I'll have to go with yes. They use this to supplement their own knowledge and of the area and their own knowledge of the journal to make a decision. So it's not a we get 5 ticks, you're in, 5 ticks, you're out. It is really just uses one of the aspects to make a decision on a manuscript's acceptability. They are the ones responsible. As a referee, it's not your job to say whether it's right or wrong for the journal. You don't know what the journal's strategic goals are at that time. So it's really, you're looking at the research independently of other factors. It's not perfect. You will probably see retractions take place, there's corrections to articles, things get rejected when perhaps they would have been sensational and gone on to be a game changer. It's a human activity and it does go wrong sometimes. And also being rejected, it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad research, it's just that it's not right for that journal at that time. So why would you do this? Because it sounds like a lot of work and no one gets paid for it. Well, actually, it is pretty rewarding. You would be the first person to see state-of-the-art research coming through, which is perhaps one of the most interesting things. It will really enhance your knowledge of the area, and it would probably, when you've seen somebody else writing in a confused and sloppy manner, you're probably not going to do that yourself. So it may enrich your own research skills and also your writing skills. And also being able to critique someone else's work, well, hopefully you'll be able to look at your own work in the same way as well. And also putting on your CV that you have refereed for X journal is probably seen as something which will help your career progression. So it's important to get involved. Everyone does it. If you want your papers to be peer reviewed, you're gonna have to do it yourself as well. How to get involved? Well, we get a lot of requests, mainly because it looks good on people's CVs, I think, to become involved in peer review and also join the editorial boards. Now, some journals will just say, yes, fine, and send someone a paper, but we are fairly cautious, it has to be said, and we usually like to know who people are before we ask them to act as a referee. So the ways that you can become known to journals, which is really what you'd need to do to be invited, is to ask one of your colleagues who already reviews for that journal you want to review and say, can you recommend me? It needs to be a sort of a person-to-person recommendation. You should network with editors at conferences, study editorial boards of your favourite journals and seek people out at conferences. You can become a society member, I'm sure many of you are. And you'll get to meet people involved in the journal decision-making process at events and things like this. You can contact journals direct, but as I said, we are quite cautious in that we probably wouldn't use someone cold. But use your contacts, your senior colleague, help them write their referee report. We ask people we've invited directly if they had help with writing a report. So we always make sure that we give credit to those who have done a substantial amount of work. And also, to get on our database, you can just create an account with your keywords, but also you should submit to the journals that you want to help referee, and that way, if we see that someone's published with us, we're more likely to use them as a referee because they understand the way the journal works and the thoroughness of the peer review that we do. You should, and Calum's going to talk about this later, but we offer a mentoring scheme where we match an early career researcher with a senior editor and get them to be involved in the decision-making process. So look out for those things as well. There's also lots of workshops at conferences, how to write a referee report, how to become involved. So there's lots of resources out there, but don't be offended if you ask and the journal never contacts you, because I think most people would want to know a little bit about you and your experience with the journal before using you. And what should you look at when you do get those invitations? Well, it's got to be interesting. What does it add to? You hopefully get a paper which is within your quite niche subject area, and does it really add something? Have they reviewed what else is out there appropriately? And does it give a clear statement of what they have done and how their manuscript advances the field? Have they used the right methods? Is it sort of ethically sound? And most journals will give you a form to fill in, which will help you, so give you pointers as to what to look at. But really, it's looking at your subject area and seeing what they're adding to it, and do their data to support the conclusions that they report in the paper. How should you write your report? Well, your role as a referee, as I said, you're not making the decision. The editor will use your report to help them make the decision. So really, your role is to improve the paper. Now, as I'm sure you would all appreciate yourselves, is when you get comments back, even if it's a negative decision, you might get some really useful comments on how to improve it. So you want to take those on board. Your role is to make that science as good as it can be. So provide constructive feedback to the authors on how to improve it, and also consider the journal-specific requirements. You should have all those available, and it's rare that you will be completely right, someone's completely wrong. These are tools to make the decision. And don't agree to report comprehensively if you really haven't got the time to do it. Everything that happens during peer review should be anonymous, and also you need to be prompt. So we know people miss deadlines, that's fine, but if your paper is out for review and it's taken 3 months to get a single report, you'd be pretty annoyed too. So make sure that when you're on the other side that you are courteous and as prompt as you can be. We know people can't always be on time, but keeping in communication is key with the journal. When should you say no? Well, you might get you get excited that you've been asked to write a report, but actually maybe it's not right for you, and you shouldn't say that you can do it if you really haven't got time. If it's completely outside your expertise and you'd be not knowledgeable enough to give a comprehensive report, then you should say no. And you should, if it's a no, just let the editorial office know so we can invite someone else. It's those kind of delays in the system which lead to decision times lengthening. And of course, if there's a conflict of interest, now different journals will have different policies on what constitutes a conflict of interest, but really if you know someone, you definitely shouldn't know them personally, you definitely shouldn't review their reports and their papers. And if you've had a recent collaboration with them, that could be considered as a possible conflict of interest. If you're not sure, declare it, and then the journal will decide whether you are unbiased enough to write a report. So here are some tips for reviewing. Usually in the invitation you'll be sent the title and the abstract. So that is what you can use to decide whether you think it's interesting enough and you really want to review it. Show integrity, so keep manuscripts confidential. Stay within the scope. You're not being asked to make a decision. This is use that guiding form to see what the journal wants from you. They might want you to address something very specific, a particular method or something, or they might want you to look at the paper as a whole. And be constructive, allow enough time, and treat others like you would like to be treated yourself with your manuscripts. Don't focus too much on the nitty-gritty sort of, oh, we've got a spelling error here and there. Comment on the overall research. Most journals have decent copy editors and checks for English language, so that can all be rectified at a later stage. So really you need to be focusing on the research itself. Look at the conclusions, make sure that the conclusions are backed up by the data, because they might be able to write some fantastic dialogue about what they've discovered, but really the data are too weak to support that. So similarly, check the robustness of the facts and make sure they're not making sort of extrapolating their data too far. And then give credit where it's due. If this is a really great paper, tell the authors, they'll be really pleased to know. There's some great resources for peer reviewers. Our publisher Wiley has a Wiley peer review website where you can find out more. So that's really peer review in a nutshell. I think it's the kind of thing that you'll learn along the way, but really getting your first assignments will really help. So make sure you use those networking opportunities and talk to journal editors to make sure they know that you're interested. So picking the right journal, as I said, there are a lot. I don't know what the number is now, but so many journals that you could pick. So which is the right one? Well, you should really be looking at the target audience, so who's reading those journals, and also be realistic in your research. And is this a groundbreaking piece of science that needs to be published in the highest impact journal that you can find, or is it actually confirmatory or perhaps not particularly interesting to a broad audience? So assess what you really think. You can ask colleagues the importance of the findings and pick the right level of journal for your initial submission. And your article will find a home. So you may think it's sort of way top, but actually it's fairly mediocre. But the peer review process will sort that out for you. And if in doubt, ask an editor. And I didn't write that, an editor did, and they are nice people, but it is true. We do take pre-submission inquiries, and a lot of good journals will do that. So I've got the email addresses at the end. But if you're not sure about whether, obviously with physiology, we for the Journal of Physiology and Experimental Physiology, it does need to move the science on quite significantly. So people sometimes aren't quite sure whether their results are quite good enough. So they check first, and sometimes it's a no, but at least that saves some time. Think about where you read the most interesting research. That's probably quite a good home for you, for your paper. And this is from Mike Tipton, Editor-in-Chief of Experimental Physiology. How do I get work published in a good journal? It's quite simple. You do a good study. So we'll talk about how to write in a minute, but really, in order for you to publish where you perhaps really want to publish, you need to think, when you're doing the conception of your research protocols, you need to be thinking about journal publication at that stage, not just once you've got all your data in. So what is a high quality journal? Obviously, we'd all aspire to publishing the very best we could. Recently, there's been a new sort of subset of journals called predatory open access journals. It's very easy to get hoodwinked, I'd say. There's lots of emails going around which look very genuine, and they probably aren't, because a lot of journals won't send out emails saying, come submit to us, it's really easy, just email us here and then it'll be published. That's really not how journals work. So it's an exploitative process where they encourage you to submit, you pay a fee, and then it gets published, but it doesn't go through those peer review checks. So please be careful. If it doesn't feel quite right, it probably isn't. So never respond to an email link, perhaps, and always just double check on the journal's website that is the right journal you're submitting to. It could be Journal of Physiology, not the Journal of Physiology. Just make sure you are submitting to genuine journals. Good journals should provide excellent services to authors. So as I said, there's a lot of resources on the Wiley site. So we link to it from our websites. There's how to write your papers, how to respond to referee comments. So there's lots of resources available. So please do look at them. They're very helpful, especially for people at the earlier stage of their publishing career. We also do things like social media. So, you know, is the journal tweeting the papers it publishes? Does it offer prizes, things like that? So make sure that the journals are investing in their authors and their readers. You have probably all heard of journal impact factors. Well, that is one of the metrics that you can look at, but it is not particularly helpful. It was actually a tool originally made for librarians to help identify which journals they should buy. It had nothing to do with the quality of the research that a journal published. So it's a metric that you can use. It can be manipulated, it's untransparent, and also clinical journals, for instance, will have much higher impact factors because the work published in there tends to be cited much more quickly than, say, in life sciences. So because the impact factor only looks at a two-year window, then you're going to be skewed by subject area as well. So there's lots of problems with it. And also there's the San Francisco Declaration Research Assessment, DORA, which we have signed up to, and is a sort of commitment to not overplaying the impact factor. It is a metric, we display it, but we don't promote ourselves by it, because there are lots of other things to look out for. So other citation metrics, you can look at total cites. So although the Journal of Physiology's impact factor is around about 5, it's got the highest number of title cites in all of physiology. Now, surely that is perhaps not more important than a 2-year snapshot of papers, which can be highly skewed by one paper in that year. So there's other things, cited half-life, as is very long for both journals, so it's the research we publish is trusted. Other ones that you can look at, and also quite an important one, which some journals display, some don't, is the citation distribution. So if you're an average Joe kind of researcher, you want to know that your paper is going to be read and cited. Well, maybe we've got all these amazing citation metrics because of that one sensational paper we published in the last 2 years. Well, actually, for our journals, most papers get cited a little bit. We don't have a highly skewed citation distribution curve, whereas some other journals with much higher impact factors do. So take everything together and make your decision. Then non-citation metrics include downloads, time from submission to accepted to decision, and whether we highlight research in different ways, such as blogs, press releases, editors' picks, that sort of thing. So there's a whole lot that you can look at before making your decision. Don't base it just on one metric, which isn't fit for purpose. So I'm now going to talk about writing your paper. I'm not an editor, I am a publisher. So I haven't written up. This is for advice from our editors in chief, Kim Barrett and Mike Tipton. But it's some really useful tips anyway. As I mentioned, really you should start thinking about publication, which is your end goal, when you're planning your study itself. So think about what you will need, what data collection you'll need to do to get that paper as good as possible at the time when you come to submit. Decide on the authors as early as possible. I've got another couple of slides on that because it's really important. Make sure you do a thorough literature search, make sure what you are writing up hasn't been already published elsewhere, and write up the methods as you're going along. You'll find it much easier. And also you could consider writing up the results quite early, because then that you'll be able to see where you've got some gaps in your research. And it's important to get some input from colleagues. Don't do this on your own. And also know the journal that you want to look for. Look at the instructions for authors, read them carefully, make sure you meet the policies. It might be that you're in a country where certain ethical methods are fine in that country, but it's not okay for that particular journal. So make sure that you're adhering to the policies of the journals that you wish to submit to. So I mentioned authorship. So this is really important. If at all possible, you should, when you're planning your study, you should talk about authorship. It avoids some perhaps quite nasty arguments later down the line. The criteria for authorship is quite strict. You should have contributed substantially to the intellectual content of the paper, and you must have approved the final versions. All these criteria we link to it from our websites, and most good journals conform to the ICMJE criteria for authorships, which is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. I think I've got that right. There's lots of information. Make sure everyone qualifies. We often find people thinking, oh, well, that lab technician was really nice and really got some really good data for us. Let's put them on as author. Well, did they write the paper? If they didn't write the paper, then they can't be an author, but they should be acknowledged, absolutely. But you just need to make sure you fully understand what constitutes authorship. There's people who haven't spoken for decades because back early on in their career, one thought they should be first author, the other thought they should be first author, and they never spoke again. So get this agreed as soon as you can. Any changes in the original author order will be queried. So if you've suddenly added an author because they helped with the revisions you were asked to do by the journal, fine, but we do need to clarify that sort of thing. What if someone's dropped off the authorship? Maybe they had a bust up with the PI. Well, they should probably still be an author. So we do check these things, get it right, and know exactly what each person has contributed towards the final paper. So you all know the basic outline. It's the introduction, methods, results, and discussion. And that's the way that the manuscript flows. That's what we're all used to. And that's how things were done in 1665 as well. But you don't have to do it in that order. So the advice is to write the methods first, write in the past tense and use the correct format for the journals. Describe what you have done, reasons for doing it, and include enough detail so that others can repeat the work. There's a lot of crisis in reproducibility in research at the moment, so please do make sure that everyone can follow precisely what you did. Next, you should probably write the results. So you don't need to write them up in the chronological order of you performing the study, but you should write them in a way that flows. So a reading order, a sensible reading order, rather than the order in which you did them. Only report the results which are relevant to the hypothesis of that particular study. This is not your thesis where you bung everything in. Just do it on the data that support your hypothesis and your conclusions. Provide enough interpretation that the reader takes the reader through how you got to the end result. So overall, you should just tell a story, lead people through what you have done and how you've got to your conclusions. Then write the discussion. This is the present tense. This is what you know now after you have done your analysis and your experiments, and state the answer to your question. So this is really, we've done this, we've got the results, and this is now what we think. Don't you should explain your answer, but don't think they're better than they are. Make sure that you can back up everything you say with your data. And you should also here discuss the wider significance of your results, but perhaps don't go too far. You could talk a couple of steps down the line. We're basic researchers. You're not going to be, you could say it is clinical relevance, but of course, if it was any kind of therapeutic target, then we're going to be a long way off for having any kind of intervention or therapy. So extrapolate, but not too far. Avoid, well, I spoke to this person at this meeting and they said this was really interesting because, well, make sure you're backing your discussion up with relevant citations, not personal communications. Introduction, counterintuitive, but you should write this last. You now know what results you're presenting, what it means in the wider context. So now you can talk people through the purposes of this paper. This is where you get people interested in the topic. What are you asking and why? And then hopefully the manuscript will flow quite nicely. And why are you doing this study? I mean, that's really important. What will this help us to understand? And finally, the title and the abstract. Now, this is what people see when you're looking on PubMed or people are being invited to referee your paper. The title and the abstract is really key to get this right. This is what search engines will crawl all over. It should include your key findings. It should be specific. And this will ultimately influence whether anyone wants to read your paper. So without an interesting sort of enticement to download your paper, no one's going to read it. So get this right. And also, if you're asked to revise your paper, which you inevitably are, make sure you revise your title and your abstract, because it's no good having an abstract for the first version. You've probably added data or removed things or tweaked it a bit. So make sure that the title and the abstract do match the revisions that you have made. Again, lots of resources. I've used the Wiley Exchanges one here, and what makes a good abstract, and also some tips on how you can do a good title and abstract for search engine optimization. So here's some tips for success. Well thought through hypothesis, having the right controls, pick the right journal, know its editors, know its scope, read the instructions as thoroughly as possible, make sure that you adhere to all the policies, otherwise it's just wasting your time and that of the journals. Make sure you're thorough and you don't make careless mistakes. We don't actually allow people to submit cover letters, but if you're writing a cover letter, make sure you get the editors' names right, or just don't make sloppy mistakes, because if people see mistakes in that kind of thing, they'll assume you make mistakes in your science. So get someone to check it first, just for little typos. I know the niggly bits, and you're a scientist, what you do in the lab is more important. Well, actually, it makes you look quite bad if you can't formulate a good submission. Also, you should know when to stop. You will never get it perfect. You will never go straight down that line to acceptance. So stop revising it, get someone to look at it, make sure it tells a good story, and know when you're ready to submit. Now, fundamentally, confirm receipt. We have people sometimes say, oh, it's been 6 months since I submitted to your journal. We haven't had a decision. That's very unusual. Let's have a look. Well, actually, they never press the submit button. It's just been sitting in no man's land for months. So make sure you get an email receipt from your journal. Revisions, most papers will be asked for revisions. It's okay, don't get mad. If they didn't understand your work, maybe you didn't write it properly. So don't blame the referees saying that you need to do more. But if you do need to, if they're asking you to do more, but you really can't, or you don't believe you should, you can say, actually, no, we're not going to do that because of these reasons. So you can make sure you defend everything and you ask for things one by one. And also look for the clues from the editor. The editor may look at the reports and say, actually, yes, these bits need to be done, but you don't need to worry about these things. So read everything thoroughly. Don't get mad, don't act on it, don't appeal things straight away. Give it a few days and then respond. So you might need to go back to the lab, you may not. Address each of the comments one by one. It really helps when it goes back to the same referees to see what they said and also what your response is. Make sure that you thank them as well. They've put a lot of time into that. And also you could also get someone to check your response, make sure you're not being rude or miss the point. Common reasons for rejections is like one of the top ones for us is probably that it's out of scope. It's not elucidating a new function or mechanism, or perhaps the results and reported in the manuscript aren't sort of moving the field forward as much as we would hope. Other things could be poorly designed or inconclusive studies. There are a lack of controls. Poorly written is a common reason, but it would have to be pretty poorly written for a referee not to understand the science. But as I said, poorly written things, well, maybe your science is conducted poorly as well. So make sure you read all the journal policies. If you can't adhere to our ethics policy or our statistics policy, then just don't submit in the first place. It will just save time. And we don't publish purely descriptive manuscripts, but some journals do. So make sure you pick that right journal, and it is what they will be looking for. As I said, there's lots of journal policies. Here's a list of just some of them. Probably key for the ones which people fall short on most frequently are the animal experiments and human experiments, and making sure they've got the right authorization to conduct them. Have a look at journal instructions for authors to make sure you're addressing all these things. Also make sure you check with your funders to see if they've got any requirements about open access and that sort of thing. So have a thorough look at the journals beforehand. Now, a few things just as I wrap up on publication ethics. Now, this is thankfully not a huge part of my job, because our referees check very thoroughly all the manuscripts that get sent to them, and we usually catch things before anything's published. But most things do need to be investigated anyway, and some of the things that I've seen are fairly shocking. So they're increasing in the literature. It's hard to know whether it's just ignorance or there's too much pressure from fundings and promotion pressures, but we take them very seriously, and you could be sanctioned. We could inform your institution, and you could lose your career prospects as a result of any foul play. So make sure that you are completely above board. Most journals follow the COPE guidelines. So this is the Committee on Publication Ethics. There's a publicationethics.org website where you can have a look at all the things. It's really interesting to see what people do to get published. Here's some common ethical things. Data fabrication and falsification is probably the worst one. This is just completely making up your data. Plagiarism. Now this can be tricky because someone might have written a sentence perfectly before, but well, that is plagiarism if you take it and you don't put it in quotes. So We do scan everything. Most journals do scan things for plagiarism, but plagiarism also applies to intellectual plagiarism. So it might not be word for word, but you're taking someone else's idea. So do just make sure that everything you submit is your own doing, or you can defend where it comes from. Duplicate publication, redundant publication. This is where you're submitting to more than one journal at the same time, or you're using text from your own previous work, so not plagiarism, in a new paper. Well, you should actually rewrite it. Authorship disputes I mentioned, they are perhaps the least severe, but perhaps cause the most trauma when you're falling out with your lab members. Conflict of interest, that does come up from time to time. Make sure that you declare everything, and then someone else can be the judge. Most journals ask you to put a conflict of interest statement on your manuscript. So data fabrication and falsification. So you should never remove any data. You should not improve your results to make them look prettier. You can change contrast and things like that, but you should do it to all of your paper, all of your figure, not just pick and choose. You should present your results exactly as you have obtained them. Indeed, we will ask for authors to provide original Western blots of their or any blots in their manuscripts, so we can make sure that what they are reporting has not been manipulated. And don't withhold data that doesn't fit your hypothesis. You can talk about that in your discussion. So really, figures should be as they have originally been captured. So here was a submitted image, and when the authors from the APS journal were asked to provide the originals, this is what they provided. And apparently, this is where the submitted image came from. So as you can see, they've obviously manipulated this, goodness knows how, so much that it's completely unrecognizable from what was captured in the lab. So don't do that. You might also want to make your images look more beautiful. So again, this was from an APS journal. You can see that when the illustrator was looking at the manuscript, she saw these sort of squares and wondered what they were. And then it transpired that the authors just cropped out some fragments on the slide that they didn't like. Well, it's not changing the meaning of anything, sure, but why are you doing this? It's just, they should be as original. Ditto for this one below. So we've got on the left, that's what the original image is, and we've got some dark marks, and then they decided to make the ones that they were particularly interested in even darker and remove the one which they didn't like the look of so much. Again, this is not changing the meaning of the results, it's just it's manipulation. You can discuss cell fragments or whatever, but you shouldn't obscure them. And then this panel was submitted with various different cell types, I think it was. So it's got a few things captured on a single panel, which looks lovely. But when asked to, when it was looked at further, this was actually made up of several different images. Now you can put things together, but you need to put crop marks on them. So if it's a single capture, use a single capture. Don't consolidate anything without putting dividing lines in there. And then improper adjustment. So as I said, you can make changes to your image as long as you apply it to the whole image. However, you can go a little bit too far sometimes. So number one there is what was captured, and then they've changed the contrast so much that it comes out with this nice single band in number 4. Well, you can tell that that level of adjustment is not acceptable. So there's lots of things that people do to try and make their results look pretty and get published, but you really should avoid any of these things. Make sure you're above board at all times. It is just not worth it. And that is pretty much it from me. As I said, there's some contact email addresses here. So my personal one is Sally Howells, showells@physioc.org. And then there's the 3 journal email addresses as well. So if you have any pre-submission inquiries, then please send them that way, or anything to do with publishing, just email me. That's no problem at all. I'll be happy to help. So with that, I'll hand back to Julia.
Great, thank you so much, Sally. So now that we've had sort of an overview of how to improve your manuscript and common ethical pitfalls, and also insight into the peer review process, we turn to our second speaker, Calum Wilson. Calum is Research Associate at Strathclyde Institute of Pharmacy and Biomedical Science, and he's going to share his experience of publishing as an early career researcher and also tell us a bit about the Editorial Board Fellowship scheme, which the Physiological Society runs. So this scheme is for early career researchers to join the editorial board for 2 years and to be mentored by a senior editor. So over to you, Calum.
Okay, so hi everybody. As Julia just introduced, I'm Calum Wilson and I'm a Sir Henry Wellcome Research Fellow at the University of Strathclyde. I just want to start off by thanking Sally and everyone else, that's Julia and everyone else at the Journal of Physiology and the Physiological Society for organising this series of seminars, and to thank you for staying with me for part 2 of this webinar here, where I'm going to share some of my experience in publishing very much as a beginner. So the first thing I want to talk about is just what happens to papers when they are submitted to the Journal of Physiology. I mean, this is largely similar to how most journals actually work. And Sally provided me with the data for this, but what I can tell you is that 1,183 research papers were submitted to the Journal of Physiology last year in 2019. And of these papers, every single one of them are given to the editorial board to scrutinise. And after this scrutiny, about 40% of these papers are triaged, which Sally explained earlier. That's when a paper is rejected by the editors without peer review, and it's sometimes also known as a desk rejection. But this happens when a paper isn't sufficiently rigorous enough for the journal, or perhaps if it falls out with the scope of the journal. But the remaining 60% of papers, that's about 710 of these research papers, were all sent out for peer review. And they were sent to a reviewing editor who is associated with the journal and at least 2 external expert referees. And through various rounds of revisions, 40% of these papers were ultimately accepted for publication in the Journal of Physiology, and 60% of them were rejected. They didn't make it to publication. But that works out to be an overall publication rate that's somewhere in the region of about 22 to 24% for research articles. And the whole process generally takes about 30 days. But as you're going to see in a minute, my research career is very much still in its infancy. But as an author, I think I've very quickly sort of travelled every path on this diagram here. I've had papers triaged, I've had papers rejected after first review, after revisions, but I've also been lucky enough to have papers accepted. And so I have here on this slide, it's just a timeline very briefly. It's my career in terms of research papers, so it's quite short. But I initially started out as an electronic engineer, and I came out of my undergraduate degree, I think like most people, with no publications to my name. But I went on to do my doctoral studies, and I combined a small amount of engineering knowledge with a bit of a developing interest in physiology. And I was fortunate enough that right at the end of my PhD, or actually just after, I was able to publish as a first author the majority of my work in the Journal of Physiology. And I then went on as a postdoc, and I continued to publish work from my doctoral studies, and also from another project that ended up again being published by the Journal of Physiology. And so I'm really grateful to everyone that was involved in getting these papers through the publication process, because these ultimately became the backbone of an application for a successful Wellcome Trust Fellowship, which is where I am now. And I don't really know what the future holds, but I think so far I've done okay publishing papers, but I definitely wouldn't say I'm an expert, because I'm definitely not. But there is one thing I've learned, and it's that it doesn't matter how good you think your paper is. When I first wrote every single one of my papers, I obviously thought they were brilliant, and I was really excited about submitting them. But what you soon learn is that your papers are never perfect. and that they're always going to be made better. And the reason that they're made better is because they've got to go through peer review. And so I just want to now share what for me is at least a pretty typical timeline of the peer review and paper publication process. And so this slide here, it's for the first lead author paper that I had written from my PhD studies. And it was submitted to the Journal of Physiology in May 2015, and it had about 8 figures at the start. And this was obviously my first lead author paper, and I was very excited about submitting this. But my excitement was soon sort of dashed roughly a month later when the manuscript was rejected at the Journal of Physiology. Now every rejection is bad news, but when we received this particular rejection, we were given a brief piece of hope as well, because the editor told us that if we were able to address all of the comments that they and the referees had, and we would be able to resubmit, and the journal would reconsider their decision. So we read through these comments, and I'll be honest, I took every single one of them pretty personally. But after taking a few days to take a step back and sort of calm down, we set about designing and performing a series of new experiments that would address the reviewer comments. And then we resubmitted the manuscript. It was a couple of months later in August. It had a few additional figures in it. And after just some minor revisions, it takes us to about October time, and we were successfully or accepted for publication in the Journal of Physiology. And that was with 2 extra figures of data and a good few months later. So this was my first sort of rodeo, so to speak, my first experience of firsthand of the peer review process. But I've now published a number of papers, and this is pretty much the process that has happened with every single one of them. Often it starts with a rejection from one journal, but we simply just go on to try and address any comments and resubmit to another one. And ultimately, what we find is that you will find the right venue for your journal, for your work, and you will get published. But I think this timeline really sums up the experience that most early career researchers have with the peer review process. You're mostly on the sharp end of reviewers' comments, and you really only have limited knowledge of what the editorial and peer review process is. And that was certainly true for me. Most of what I did know about the processes that went into making these decisions about rejection or revisions was only really passed on from my supervisors or from colleagues. But that all changed when I think it was in 2018, the Journal of Physiology announced their inaugural Editorial Board Fellowship scheme. Some of you might have heard of this scheme before, but for those of you who haven't, what it is an opportunity for early career physiologists to get involved with the journal and to learn about the peer review and editorial process. I mean, it really is an excellent opportunity to gain insight into both sides of the publication process. And so I've been an editorial board fellow for what's coming up to about 2 years now. I'm just coming up to the end of my 2-year term. And just to explain exactly what it is, I'm just going to flip to this slide here, which shows you the structure of the editorial board at the Journal of Physiology. So you can see here at the top, we have the editor-in-chief, Kim Barrett, and the managing editor who just spoke before me, that's Sally Howells. And together, Kim and Sally lead a team of senior editors who are all active scientists and who are all ultimately responsible for all papers that are submitted to and published in the Journal of Physiology. Now, these senior editors have a lot of papers to deal with, and so they they rely on the expertise of a pool of reviewing editors who they assign each paper to. And it's the reviewing editor that is responsible for deciding whether a paper should be sent out for peer review. They're responsible for assigning reviewers to the manuscript, and ultimately the reviewing editors are responsible for interpreting reviewers' reports and making a recommendation for or against publication, or for revision, or for whatever else. And so as an editorial board fellow, you perform exactly the same role as a reviewing editor. You're another option that the senior editor can choose. And the only difference is that you perform these roles with the guidance and mentorship of the more experienced senior editors. And so I think everyone that's been involved with this scheme would really agree that it's been quite a good success. And I think that's because it is largely driven by the enthusiastic senior editors. They really do want to get involved and teach and mentor early career scientists like myself. So I hope that this will encourage at least some of you that are watching this to apply. I think the applications won't open up again until next year, but when they do, you should really think about it, because there's really is a lot to gain. For example, and Sally sort of alluded to some of this, but you can learn the fundamentals of peer review and how to properly assess the quality of manuscripts. And by doing this, by getting exposure to lots of peer review, to lots of different critiques and rebuttals of other people's papers, this will only ultimately improve your own ability to navigate the peer review process. And so on that note, I just want to finish up by sharing a few tips on what I think I've learned by experience in both sides of the publication process. So my first tip is when you're writing your papers, you should really remember that people don't want to think too long and too hard about your work. They want you to explain it to them, and they want you to explain it well. So spoon feed them the information. Make sure that all your main points really pop out of your paper. And I think one thing that can really help with this is if you remember that reviewers and readers should really be able to understand your work just by looking at your figures. Nice figures make for good papers. So then if after you submit your perfect paper to the perfect journal, but you find that it's rejected, well, I think you really need to take this as an opportunity to realize that your paper wasn't perfect, but this is an opportunity to improve it. So address all the points made by the reviewers before you submit it elsewhere. And even if you don't think that addressing these points are going to improve your manuscript, just remember that it might end up being sent to the same referee. If you're lucky and you get past the first round of review and you're asked to resubmit, then really do make an effort to address each point made by the referees. If it's something major that they highlight, this usually means that you need to include new experiments and new figures. And yeah, you should also remember, I think Sally said this, referees are humans and they do this on a volunteer basis. So always be polite and be respectful. Yeah. And so now I think back to Julia.
So just before we move on to Q&A, thank you so much for that, Calum, and hopefully we'll get some applications from the listeners. And like you said, the call opens in January or February for next year for the Editorial Board Fellowship. So just before Q&A, I just wanted to mention an upcoming conference of ours that you might be interested in. So you'll see it on the screen. It's called Future Physiology, and it will be running during the week of July 6th. So this is a series of talks, workshops, and e-poster sessions. It will all be online for early career researchers by early career researchers. So this is meant to help early career researchers take that next step in their career. So please do register. The link is there and I can put it in the chat as well. So now I think we can move on to Q&A, and we've had a few questions come in. So maybe we can start off with one that's about if you have exciting developments in your conclusion, but it's a negative study where the null hypothesis has been accepted. They were asking whether, as an author, you should bin this kind of study, and also as a reviewer, whether you should reject it.
Oh yeah, I'll answer that, but maybe Calum can offer some thoughts too. It depends on the journal, really. So Physiological Reports, our open access journal, that publishes confirmatory and negative results. By no means should the data be forgotten about, because it will save someone else doing it in the future. So one of the problems with journals which only want sort of advances in the field is that the perfectly valid research which is done, which may have had negative results, is lost. So people might think, oh, well, I'll try doing that. Well, actually, someone's already done it. So find the right journal that will publish a confirmatory or negative results. And if it was conducted properly and is asking a good question, then they should be very pleased to have the results, whatever they are. So that's where picking the right journal and knowing the audience really matters. And as a referee, again, if you're refereeing for Nature, you might bin it. If you're refereeing for another journal, you probably will think it's really good science. So that's where you, as an author, know your journal, and as a referee, know your journal. So it's important to know what the journal's aims are. Calum, is there anything else?
I don't think there's anything to really add to that, apart from there's no experiment should ever be thrown in the bin.
No.
You know, every experiment's important.
I mean, there's been time and resource on your part gone into it. It shouldn't be wasted. Otherwise, the same group will try and do the same thing next time, using up additional resources. Or if it's animals, especially, we shouldn't be using more animals. So try and get it published somewhere. Someone will publish it. Or the other option, which we might have a question on, is preprints. Now, preprints is a form of publication. It doesn't. You can put something on a preprint server before peer review. We allow people to put their manuscripts on a preprint server and then submit to us. But if you don't think it's going to make it into a journal, you could put it up there so people at least know that the research has been done. It hasn't been peer reviewed, but the research has been done. So you should get it out in the public domain in some way.
Great. So another question was about someone who presented their work at one of our conferences, Future Physiology, in 2017. And they're now looking to publish their research, but they're worried that it's too long of a time gap. What would your advice be for them?
To be honest, I don't think anyone would notice. I mean, if you've been building on your abstract since then, that's fine. I mean, you should state as part of your manuscript that you have presented your abstract previously, and you should say where and when. But you might have had a career break. You might have, you could have been doing anything, and I wouldn't worry about the timelines at all. Make sure you mention that it has been presented, because that avoids any sort of copyright or problems. But no, it's fine. You've been building on your research, and now you're ready to publish. That's completely okay.
Just to add to that, I think every paper I've published has been presented in abstract form at a conference at least 2 years before I submitted to a journal.
I mean, getting things ready for publication takes a long time, so I think no one would look poorly on that at all.
Great. So if someone is trying to figure out what to include in their supplementary materials, but because they want to include everything in their results, is there kind of a bar that you've set for that?
Well, again, every journal is different, but I'll just tell you what we do. So we are very lucky that we don't have any restrictions imposed on authors on page length, number of tables or figures. We want the whole story in the manuscript. So if the data are relevant to your hypothesis, it should be in the paper. We don't want it hidden online. The Journal of Physiology is still printed. If someone's picking up a printed copy, they need to understand the full paper. So we don't want supplementary material data that supports the paper. It should all be in there. However, if there's like a movie file or something which adds a little bit to what you're presenting in the paper, then we will welcome it. But it should be, as it's called, supplementary. This is not data. We do not want half the methods online only. We want everything in. So if you put it all in, decent peer review will tell you to take it out if it's not important, but they probably will say, this is irrelevant, we don't want it at all. It's not part of the story of this particular manuscript. So you could always mention to editors, we also have this data if you think it's worth putting in, but really it sounds as if you're thinking that it's not quite right for the paper, it probably should be excluded. You might get asked to add it, and then that's fine, add it in, but don't try and just dump things as supplementary. We won't allow it. So I get asked, can we have this as supporting information, all of this? And if it's not part of the paper, no, we don't. I mean, there's no point in having it there. So you should find a different data. If you want to put your data somewhere, don't put it alongside the paper, but put it in a data repository somewhere that's open access.
Do you have anything?
I'm just sort of trying to think of what we normally put in supplementary data. And it's normally if we've asked or tried to address a particular question in multiple ways. You don't really need to have 5 figures in a paper that all say the same thing. So for the most part, in journals that I've published in that have had supplementary information, we would tend to put any related sort of figures that aren't needed for the conclusions of the paper, but they do back them up. It's that kind of thing that we would put in supplementary information. So yeah, that's how we decide.
So we've got another question here that is asking when you exclude participants from your data set. So if you have 10 participants and 9 have similar results, but one is extremely different, can you exclude them?
No, I don't think you should, because that's not what you've gathered. That could be data falsification. So discuss the outlier, why it's an outlier, but don't exclude it. You should never suppress data which doesn't support your hypothesis. Include it, discuss why it could be there and why it's different, but don't suppress it. Otherwise, well, someone else might look at that and think, well, that's an outlier. That's really interesting. That could be something else. That might not be what you're looking at all. So you should always include all data you've got. Discuss anomalies, but don't exclude.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I don't think you should ever exclude results from your analysis. That's cherry picking.
So if someone is trying to decide whether it's too early to publish, whether they have enough data and enough of a narrative, is there anything you would give as advice to them?
I would probably consult with colleagues on that one. Only you know whether it's a really sort of full paper. The problem that you might get is if you publish something too soon and then you'll carry on doing the research, will you then have enough to publish another paper? And you could be accused of doing what's called salami slicing, which is getting as many publications out of one set of data as possible, which is not good practice. So I would probably wait until you've got as full a body of evidence as you can. Then you might decide to split things, but get everything first and then see. Because you also, if you're sort of adding to an existing paper, well, maybe a journal wouldn't take it because you're replicating what's already out there in the public domain. So I would wait until you get everything and then decide how many papers it could be, bearing in mind that every single one has to tell a full story. So it may be one giant paper, which is fine, but I would perhaps wait until you've got a compelling body of evidence and talk to your colleagues about whether you've met that threshold.
So in terms of your discussion section, how long or short should that be?
We have no restrictions on that ourselves because we want people to be free to discuss things fully and completely. Some journals will have restrictions on page limits or will charge you for a number of pages you publish. I don't know if there's an answer for that. I don't know what the average is. A couple of pages? I'm not sure. Calum, you're probably better placed to see more of them.
I was just going to say, like, I think, yeah, I mean, a couple of pages is normally more than enough. As you said, Sally, the Journal of Physiology has no page limits. So I think one of our papers had quite a lengthy discussion on it. And that was actually because it was asked for by the reviewers. So a lot of the time it will, you can write a discussion and you can think you've sort of, really compared your results and put them into context with the literature. And I think that's how long really your discussion needs to be, to put it into context with existing studies. But sometimes you'll find reviewers think you've not done a good job and they really want you to make it longer. And they might want you to add discussions on the limitations of your study, for instance. And so that really is what defines how long it is. Can you put it into context, and then do the reviewers want more?
I always say that peer review will make it either longer or shorter. Do what you think's right. Yeah. It will become the right length after peer review.
So obviously we publish a bunch of different types of articles. So how do you choose which format is the best for your publication? Is it based on the amount of data that you have, or are there other criteria?
again, different journals have different article types. I think for our journals, if you're doing any original research, it's a research paper, a full-length research paper. Experimental Physiology recently launched case studies where you've got perhaps one elite athlete. Well, you haven't got a control group, for instance, there. So perhaps that would be a case study. But for the most part, if you're comparing different control groups versus experimental groups, you're probably going to be doing a full-length research paper. Most of the other article types that we do are commentary type things or debate type things. So I think, again, check if you're unsure and there's a journal you want to submit to that has, well, we've got a techniques one. You'll be knowing if you're doing a new technique, I hope. But for the most part, original data is a full-length research paper. But check with the journal you're submitting to first. It might be that there's experimental physiology, we're going to be launching something called replication studies. And that looks at, that might be looking at reproducing experiments already. So they'll be different. So take a look at the instructions for authors. It should tell you.
So we've got quite a specific one now about using power analysis for sample size calculation, and whether if you don't do this, will you automatically get rejected? It
completely depends on the journal. We've just introduced a new statistics policy at the Journal of Physiology, and power analysis isn't really touched on, I have to say. So I'm not completely up to speed on knowing whether it would be acceptable or not. Again, peer review is probably sort of tease that out, but I am no statistician, I'm afraid. I don't know, but I don't believe that we require power analyses.
Just to add to that, most of the studies I sort of do are more kind of observational and kind of basic science, so you don't really need a power analysis for that type of study. I think it's when you start getting into things like human studies and population studies, that's when this really becomes important. And it's exactly the type of thing that will get picked up by the reviewers, not necessarily by the editors.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. I mean, I don't know enough of what bits of statistics apply to what types of research, but I know that it's not a requirement for all. And if it was a requirement for a journal, then if you can defend why it's not there, then they should take that on board. But statistics policies aren't that robust yet, I have to say. We've been pushing forward to a more transparent process on reporting statistics. Not all journals are up to sort of at the same level at the moment, so do check. But I would suggest that probably it's not a requirement for most journals.
So in terms of the number of figures in your paper, is there an average, is there a minimum, maximum, or does it just depend a lot on the research?
I think it would probably depend a lot on the research, but as Calum said, often what people will do is look at the figures first. If you can't tell what your manuscript is about without sort of having a look at the figures, then there's probably not enough. So the figures should tell the story, and the legends explain what the data are. So I don't know if there's an average. I think, again, it would completely depend on the subject area. Obviously, if you're looking at muscle biopsies, you might have lots of very pretty images, but a lot of things will be fairly dull, a couple of graphs. So I don't think we can give guidance on that. But think about what Calum said about telling a story with your figures. Is there enough there?
So in terms of, this is a bit similar to the supplementary data question. It's about if you have data that you think is outside of the scope of the journal you're submitting to, then should you delete those sections, or should you transfer the entire manuscript to a broader journal just because of that data?
I think it depends how important that data are to the specific question that you're asking and answering. If it can be one mega paper addressing more than one thing, then maybe keep it all in one place. But if it's genuinely two different papers, perhaps you could submit them both to different journals. I don't think things should be suppressed. So if you've got too much, then most journals should take the full story if they if they are able to. So I'm not sure about that one. It'll be a case-by-case basis, I think. Again, peer review would sort it out, hopefully.
So this one is about the peer review process and what happens if one editor recommends a manuscript and another one disapproves.
As I said, it's not a vote. So at the Journal of Physiology, as Calum showed on one of his slides, we've got senior editors and reviewing editors. We have far fewer senior editors than reviewing editors and fellows, and they need to trust their reviewing editors. So those people are appointed because of their expertise in dealing with things like this. So the decisions do get challenged. So a reviewing editor might say, I think this is great. A senior editor might say, no. The senior editor gets the final decision. But it's not a, right, we've got one yes, one no, we now need to get another opinion. That's what the reviewing editor would do if they've got conflicting reports, and they might seek another one to make their recommendation. But, you know, it might be a decision to reject. Both editors agree, and it's the wrong decision. As I said, it's a human process. We will get it wrong, and you can appeal. So most journals allow authors to appeal. If you think it's truly the wrong decision on your paper, then you can appeal. But it's not a, you know, first past the post. It's not 2 ticks, you're in, 2 ticks, you're out. It's sometimes you might get 2 negative reports from a referee saying it's not really that interesting, but the reviewing editor disagrees and they recommend acceptance. So it's you have to look at it a bit more holistically, I think. It's not an exact science, which I know frustrates scientists.
Okay, we've got one more. Would you ever consider publishing in a lower impact journal because you believe in the work or the community, or because you think that your study fits from a thematic point of view?
Absolutely, that's what's going on your CV anyway. So you should probably always aim highest, but if you think aiming highest is what community that journal serves, then that's great for you, and it's going to be on your CV. It's, you know, it's going to help your career or not. So it's your judgment call. You might want to have a balance of papers going to perhaps the journals which might show off your skills a bit more compared to ones which really support a different need. So I don't know, Calum, do you assess that when you're looking at your research?
I think what you've really got to assess is where is the best venue. The most important thing is how many people are going to cite your paper in the end. So you really want to increase your exposure to people that are going to cite your paper. So you need to think, what are those people reading, and what journals are they reading? And if the impact factor is lower, the impact factor is lower. Like, I don't think it matters, especially, you know, now that everything's going towards open access, and it's just kind of going to matter less and less what the impact factor is. If you can get people to read your paper because they don't have to pay to access it, then it's going to be better. So I don't think the sort of ranking of the journals is that. It is important, but it's not the be all and end all of things. You need to get people to read your paper. It's what's important.
And also, what you should be challenging is not where to publish, but how are you being assessed? If you're being assessed on where you publish, you need to challenge your assessors, saying, shouldn't you be looking at the research itself? So research assessment really needs to change. Unfortunately, people are judged on which journal they're publishing at the moment. So assuming that you are probably, the person who asked that question is probably at the earlier stages of your career, you might wish to toe the line a little bit in terms of where you publish now, and perhaps you could get a bit more picky when you've been more established. But it depends what your priorities are and how you're being assessed. That's got to change first before we can really ditch the sort of hierarchy of journals.
So when you're looking for these different journals, whether or not they're higher or lower impact factor, are there any guides to finding the journals that are reaching specific audiences?
Most journals will have on their websites sort of who the journal's for, but really in your area, if you're looking at doing literature searches, you will know what you're looking at, and that's where you should be publishing. That's where most people look at a fairly sort of close group of journals probably. So you should be really publishing in that pool. That's where you're reading. So that's probably where you should be publishing. I don't know if there's any tools to really help you, but there are some sort of how do I find the right journal type websites, but really that's based more on policies rather than readership. So I think you will have a feel of what's right. If you're submitting to a journal you've never read a paper in, why are you doing that? Because your peers may not find it, or they'll see it and return to the search and think, well, I've never heard of that journal, so I'm not going to read it. So keep fairly close with the place that you're reading.
And I think we can close on this one because I believe we've answered all the questions. If you have any further questions, you can always email Sally. Her email's in the chat. It's showells@phys.org. But what, Sally, and well, if Calum has anything to add, would you say sets Journal of Physiology and Experimental Physiology apart from other journals that you might want to highlight to listeners?
I think that we are very lucky. We are society journals. The society chooses to invest time and money, as in I have a job, with developing the journals and making them the best they can be. We look after our editors very well. We really appreciate all the time that they spend. It's a voluntary role and we thank them and they love doing it. So I think we've got a really dedicated group of editors. We have good journals because we choose to make them good. You know, we're a society, we're incredibly rigorous. We invest in staff time to make the process as good as possible for editors and authors. We add things to our content for readers as well. So it's really, we have the time and money to do it. And the results are well-respected journals. People want to submit to us our metrics in terms of downloads, submissions, all that sort of thing, always on the up and looking healthy. I think the rigor and the diligence we put into our quality, the quality, the best practice side, the publication ethics standards, that's what sets us apart.
Great.
Just to add to that, I think the other thing that sets the journal and the society apart is the real sense of community everybody has. So the journal, obviously the editors are a community in themselves, but the society really is too. And you see this just not only with the sort of what they call the conferences, like physiology or Europhysiology, but also things like the upcoming future physiology as well. These things are just great. They're just a lot of fun to go along to. And these are the places where you're going to meet people that you're going to know throughout your entire career. And so I think it's just important to get involved in that community as early as possible. And it's the journal and the society really promote that. I think it's brilliant.
Great. Thank you guys so much. And hopefully some of you will be able to join us for future physiology. And I'll be sending an email after this with a bit of a resource that sort of summarizes the webinar, as well as a link to this recording so you can watch any parts of it.
And if anyone specifically wants the slides from either talk, then just email me and I'll make sure you get them.
And also I just want to mention the next webinar in this series is going to be next Thursday, and it's called You Are Not Alone, Sharing Experiences and Learning in Lockdown. So this will be kind of giving people a toolkit for managing the unexpected changes that we're having to deal with now. So hopefully you'll join us for that. There'll be a link in the email as well that you get after this. So I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and thanks so much for joining us.